My name is Arthur Blodgett, and I operate Wellspring Herpetoculture. It's my little hobby side project here. I primarily focus on keeping a few select species from the Guyana Shield region in northern South America, and largely in big planted displays and vivariums. So I'm working with spilotes and polycrust, the monkey lizards, and I also have a few other species from other regions, but the main focus is the tropical stuff. How has having a smaller collection and larger vivaria changed the hobby for me? I think the biggest thing, honestly, is that it's made it less stressful for me. Keeping stuff in higher volumes when I was younger, I often would have the experience of feeling just kind of in over my head sometimes, and approaching it this other way, starting with the vivariums first and then actually tailoring the vivariums for animals as I was acquiring them over time. It just feels a lot less stressful for me and a lot more manageable. It's easier for me to maintain kind of a reasonable collection and a reasonable pace of life in that way. What's the one thing people get wrong most with setups like these? I think that they just make it a lot more complicated than it has to be. I think that they just get really stuck in the kind of mainstream conversations around bioactive and how it has to look and it has to be this way, and you have to have this drainage layer and this substrate. And I found that experimentation is fully allowed and it's encouraged in this kind of thing, and there's no one way to do it. There's a lot of different ways you can have success keeping things in vivariums, and a lot of ways you can have success doing it in other ways too. So yeah, I think that's the main thing I see people doing wrong, is just getting really rigid in their perspectives around it and not allowing themselves to experiment because of that. The dogma stuff, it really tends to just stifle improv and creativity, and I think that's one of the major benefits to practicing herpetoculture and experimenting with that. Is just it's an opportunity to be creative and to experiment and to try different things, and I think that's what makes it rewarding. If you get too stuck in a rigid mindset of doing things one way or another, it tends to detract from the enjoyment of the hobby and my experience of it. And I'm all about progressing one's care and trying to do things better. But I think that there's also a way in which that can get to, it can become toxic too, to have too much of a progression mindset where you can actually not pay attention to what is actually working and just constantly be changing things. And I think that, especially with working with live animals, a lot of the time the animals really benefit from consistency. And so if you get too in the weeds with chasing the next thing, it can actually have a bad impact on the animals too, even if in our own minds we're improving our care or whatever. How important do I think it is to learn about light and wavelengths and infrared and all that stuff? I think that in some ways it's maybe less important to totally grasp the theory and the spectrum and all that stuff, and more to kind of break it down into easier to understand parts. Just like your reptiles need heat, which we can just call infrared, and they need light, whether that be visible light or ultraviolet light, and UV and all that. And I think that it's really helpful to think of things in those three parameters. That's the kind of main ones to focus on, I think, in herpetoculture context. That said, I think it's been for me really interesting and empowering to look more into the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and get back to middle school physics class and all of that stuff, and thinking about Roy G. Biv. And it's cool to actually see how these things fit together, and how it's they're all just different wavelengths of the same energy from the sun, essentially. And that's what we're trying to harness, and that's what our animals or reptiles have really learned to and perfected the capacity to harness for their energy. And that to me is just a really amazing thing about them. There's this statistic that I learned recently in this course I was taking that was something in human beings, 98% of the energy we take in from our food is burned up just to maintain our body temperature and to maintain homeostasis. Whereas in reptiles, 90% of the energy they take in from their food is just available for rest and recovery and repair and growth and all these other things. And it's just, and when you hear a statistic like that, it's how do we even survive being so inefficient in comparison? And yeah, and so I think it's cool to learn how they utilize these energies and how that's that's part of what makes them what they are, and part of what makes them so efficient and so alien in some ways to the way we live. Yeah, I think in terms of the current products and the tech that's out there, I think that with what's out there, people can do a really good job and provide really well for their animals. And I think that the main limitation that I see is that it's hard to get like an all-in-one solution. There's not really a good all-in-one solution, you know? And so for all of my setups, typically I have 3 different types of lights on each setup. You know, I have LEDs for the visible light section, and I have UV for obviously the ultraviolet section, and then I have halogens for the infrared and the heat provision. And ideally, I mean, it would be amazing, you know, if we could get to a position with technology where we could provide a good quality of all of those things in one bulb. I don't know if that's even possible or how close we are to that. I do know that there's been significant advancements in LED UV technology. It doesn't seem like it's exactly like fully where we want it to be yet, but it does look like it's headed in that direction, and that's really promising, especially because a lot of species will actually prefer to bask under LEDs instead of their UV because it's just a more intense light, and a lot of the way that they're actually choosing to select a basking site is based on the light intensity and less on like necessarily the wavelength that they're receiving from it. So I feel excited about where the tech is going. And as it stands right now, I feel like, you know, I feel good knowing that I'm providing at least those kind of 3 general categories of radiation, you know, and knowing that the animals are getting what they need in that respect. Do I think it's more easy to work with large species like Spilodies and the type of enclosures that I use? Definitely. I think it's a lot easier in my experience. At least it provides a lot more security for the animal for me. I found that Spilodies are just super alert, inquisitive. You know, they've got these big eyes, they're really visually oriented, and they're pretty sensitive snakes, and they're very defensive if they feel cornered or cramped. And I found that when I move them into this larger vivarium, which has an extra foot in depth, it's about 3 feet deep from the enclosure that they were in before, that they're just much more relaxed. And so I can like walk right up to the glass of the vivarium and, you know, be 12 inches away from the snake, and it'll be relaxed and comfortable basking because it knows that it has another 12 inches or more behind it where it can escape if it wants to. Whereas before, I think that even just with that 1 foot less of depth, they were a lot more nervous. And if I would approach the enclosure, they would sometimes put on a threat display or sometimes go hide. And so I find that it really encourages a lot more natural behavior. I just see them, they're more active, they're more visible. And that obviously for me as a keeper is a lot more enjoyable, getting to actually see them. And it, you know, it feels better too, you know, being able to approach the enclosure and not have them strike at the glass, you know, or puff up, and to know I'm not stressing them out too bad. I think it works well for them. But the lizards, I feel similarly. I think that really with all of these sensitive species, a huge, hugely overlooked factor in their care is just their sense of security. I think that it's really hard to provide security to animals that rely on flight as their primary mode of defense in a box, because they know they can't get away. And so the bigger that box is, or the more complex it is in terms of visual barriers and foliage and all of that stuff, I think that really makes a difference in helping them to just feel more secure, especially with stuff that's, you know, coming in just wild caught. It really helps them to acclimate better and just settle into the environment more, I've found. How do I see the hobby evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? This is a fun question. I think that we're going to see a lot better technology coming out. I think that like I said earlier about the lights, just the improvements in LED lighting. There's some cool, you know, new enclosure manufacturers coming out that are working with kind of more lightweight materials, like Leap, for example. That's all like really encouraging to me to see more, just like more appropriate technology emerging. I think that a lot of times people have been kind of making do, and there's been a lot of like DIY tinkering and stuff like that to provide the best for our animals. And on one hand, that's really fun, and I really like doing all that stuff. And on the other hand, you know, I think that for the average person that doesn't like doing that stuff, the animals end up paying the price in the end of the day, probably. And so it's really cool to see some better technology coming out. And I think that'll probably improve just kind of baseline welfare standards. And I think that that's probably one of the major things that I see changing is just more and more people seem to be embracing just kind of a higher like minimum standards for reptiles, which I think is a really good thing. I think that especially with kind of more recent science coming out about just like their cognitive abilities and all that stuff, we're realizing that for a long time people have underestimated reptiles, and in some ways that's, I think, contributed to them not receiving the best kind of care standards in comparison to some other types of pet animals. And yeah, so I think that that's all going to improve, hopefully. And I also think that there's a growing trend toward kind of smaller scale, kind of more specialized breeders. I feel like more and more I'm seeing people kind of focusing in on just like one or two or a few different species and just like really trying to do it super well with those, and offering really high quality animals and a lot of knowledge to back up what they're selling, which again, I think is a great thing for the hobby as a whole. And also just, imagining coming in as a, first time reptile owner or a pet keeper, I think that's just a much better way to enter into the hobby than, say, going to your local big box store and buying a imported Chinese water dragon that's not going to do well. Yeah, so I'd say that those are the major things that I see changing in the next 5 to 10 years. And hopefully that'll also discourage some of the outside regulatory pressure that's kind of inundated the hobby in the last decade or so, and increasingly in the last 5 years. I think that the better we represent ourselves as a community, the less susceptible we'll be to that kind of outside agitation.